Okay. So are you ready? Everything is
Yes,
all right?
everything is ready. All right.
Or okay. Well, then, for everybody, Professor Durganand Balsavar from India founded Artist Human Settlement Research Collaborative and has 31 years of academic experience and practice. Graduating from the CEPT Ahmedabad with an exchange studio at ETH Zurich. After working in Paris and Zurich, he returned to India to work with the Pritzker Laureate B.V. Doshi. He has organized several national and international symposiums on future cities, disasters, mitigations, and worked extensively in the rehabilitation after the tsunami, as well as war refuge rehabilitation. He is a nominated member of a Chennai Master Plan Committee, Berlin Climate Policy 2050 program, and the session chairs. Well, it's a very extensive curriculum. Maybe it's going to be longer than your presentation, and so welcome, and it's a pleasure for us, an honor to be with us. You know, we have many students from India hearing you right now. So let's start with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Javier. And it is really an honor to be here in this presentation and to be invited to present in the research lab talks. Uh, I'm really honored to be here. Uh, so when Javier discussed with me and we invited me to talk, I was just thinking, what can this presentation be? And then I thought maybe it's not only because we are all in quarantine, but something more about the experience of architecture, or how do we try to live on this earth. And I thought maybe it can be more about questions that happen rather than giving solutions or doing an analysis. But in the questions at the end of the conversation or when I'm presenting, I feel anyone can ask any question and we can discuss it. So this presentation will be at one level more like a journey, a story, a narrative. And at another time, it may be a little philosophic, but I will also try to bring in very strong architectural details also. And because I studied in India in CEPT Ahmedabad in a school which was started by Professor B.V. Doshi. Everyone knows Professor B.V. Doshi. So I studied in his school, and then I worked with him for many years. At the same time, I studied in ETH Zurich, and in ETH Zurich, I met architects like Snodzy and Schneebly and Aldo Rossi, Fumi Komaki, who were, so at one level of my studies was very, very rational in Switzerland, and in India, very, very experiential and sometimes even emotional. But in this experience of studying in Europe, studying in India, I started beginning to realize the differences. And the differences were emerging in my thought because of geography, because of topography, and because of territory in which we make our journeys. So that is why I called it the geography of imagination, because the first act or the first thing a human being is doing in order to live is using the imagination. And The minute we use the imagination, I think architecture begins. And that's why I called it the geography of imagination, because it's an imagination that comes with a conversation or a dialogue with a place. So each of these words actually can have many meanings. If I use the word geography, if I use the word place, if I use the word architecture, it can today have 1,000 meanings. There's not one meaning. So all of us today in this digital space will get many meanings from the same thing which is being discussed, and all the meanings actually have a value. So what I will do now is that I will try and overlap a kind of a history, and at the same time try to weave that history with my own experiences of that place, with memories, with certain observations of that place, with how that architecture uh, influenced or had a deep impact on my mind. Because at that time, what happens? It forms us, forms our own identity, and as architects, we are also forming space which creates identity. So it's a cycle. We are creating space, and then the space is influencing us, and again we are creating space. So it's a cycle between inhabiting space, making space, adapting to space, and traveling. So Javier, if I can share my slide presentation with this brief background.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right,
I
go
will
ahead.
share a presentation and then is it visible?
Yes,
Okay.
very
So
good.
this is, yeah, thank you. So this is really a presentation, and I will just, it will be an experiential presentation. So it will have some ideas, it will have some imaginations, it will show a few images which have remained very strong in my own memory. And it will really look at what is this place, where are we going, and what are we building, or what are human beings making on this earth. So that's the kind of question which may come as we are going through this presentation. So I begin with first what I have called an imagination of India. Now it is very difficult for us to define or say what is India, because there are so many interpretations of this region. There are so many different ways of living in this region. And I was talking to Joaquim some time back, and I was telling him that in India today, I have friends who are living still in the 8th century. I have friends who are living in the 14th century. I have friends who are living contemporary times. So we may be located in 2021, but our mind is living still in many centuries. Javier has been to Jaipur, and I'm sure he has had a experience of how people are maybe living in the 16th century. They may have a mobile phone, they may have a car, but still in the mind, they're living in the 16th century. And I think that is the very, very interesting part of India, that even with globalization and all these other things, India still continues to live in many different times at the same time. And because of that, it becomes very diverse, very complex, and very enjoyable. So these are just some images of India. One is Ajanta Ellora, the rock cut caves. You wonder 2000 years ago why the Buddhists cut these caves in this way. And then there are many reasons and many things which are we can describe, but many things which are intangible, unmeasurable, which we cannot describe, but we can experience maybe to a certain extent. And then we have the city with all the streets, which I will come back to later. And then you have medieval times, Fatehpur Sikri, a city, and of course we have Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, who were very, very instrumental or significant in inspiring the modern Indian architects like Charles Correa, Doshi. At the same time, there are some geographical imaginations of Europe. I have brought this in so that we have some kind of idea of a difference. I don't want to describe that difference very clearly, but as we start discussing, maybe we'll get some idea of the difference. And the reason is not for the sake of difference. The reason is because of the geography of that imagination. So the focus is not difference. The focus is on the geography. The focus is on the place. The focus is on the need to inhabit a place. Difference comes out naturally. We don't focus on difference. So I called it the geography of inhabitation. And of the few, there were many places that influenced me very deeply in Europe, which I visited. I stayed there for for a long time, studied them. And the first I would say was Laureate, the monastery. I stayed there for about 2 or 3 months. And this is the room that I stayed in, and it had a very strong influence on thinking. The other was the Pantheon and the way in which it opened to the sky. And of course, San Marco Piazza, Ronchamp, and Palladio. There are many more, but I have just selected a few because we have 1 hour for a conversation, and it's more to provoke an imagination, more to provoke a thinking, more to provoke why did we build all this. So then we come to ancient Indian text, the writings. So if we research ancient Indian writing, the word for geography is Bhugol. Now, Bhugol means that the planet is a sphere. So it means that the ancient Indian astronomers, astrologers, scientists were aware that the planet is a sphere. And they were aware that the planet moves around the sun. So always the sun was the center of our existence. So that is why the sun temple, and this sun temple accepts the sun rays exactly on the axis when you get the equinox. It is very similar to, I think, some of the temples in Machu Picchu in South America, where in the equinox you get the ray of the sun on an exact axis to the center of the temple. So it means that measurement of cosmic, celestial planets, objects were always a communication of architecture on earth with the sky, and that's why the sun became very important. And then if we look at the imagination that grows, so we don't, for an architect, I don't look at only the buildings. We look at how the making happens even of things, of artifacts. Something is made. Something is made with a lot of care. Something is made with a lot of skill. Something is made with a lot of understanding of the material, whether it is wood, whether it is brass, whether it is clay, whether it is stone or concrete. And I think when we begin to understand this material, understand a place, and understand what is the spirit of the place, I think that kind of architecture is really respecting the geography of that imagination. And then there is this idea of journey. I'm raising certain concepts in architecture. One is the idea of place, the other the idea of making, the idea of journey, and destination. So anytime we talk of destination, most often when we talk of destination, we are asking where are we going, why are we going there, what will we get when we reach there. But both become important, the journey and the destination. It's not as if the journey was less important than the destination. So we always have a debate whether product or process, which is more important. I would say process is as important as the product, because product itself, when it grows old, becomes a process. So a product is not static. Even a product starts facing, so product is at the level of a thing. But if we look at a building, or if we look at something that was built, something that was carved out, after the architect has finished, time takes over, the rain comes, there's decay, the color changes, and each artifact starts aging. So even the destination keeps changing because of time. So when we look at these experiences, especially in India, I'm taking examples in India. Now, one is Ahmedabad, where I studied and worked for many years. I was there for about 10 to 14 years. The other is Jodhpur and Jaipur, which I travel very often. And I was working on the Jaipur plan for a year, with extension plan that Professor Doshi was designing and planning. So when we are planning these cities and we look at these ancient towns and streets, we will see that the street is really something of a multiple experience. There's mixed use. You may find a shop, you will find a home, we will find a gateway. So there is a mixed use. And if you see in Jaipur, that mixed use gets more formal and organized. The imagination now starts growing into a pattern. So while there is a geography, the imagination could be very organic in India, or the imagination can be a combination of a geometry and organic. And so we find that the materials used are locally available, the skills are locally available. The climate is responding. It's hot climate, but when we enter the buildings, there's no fan, no air conditioning, and the buildings are very cool. So it means that even as a design, as a sustainable climatic design, these buildings are very responsive to the geography. On the right, to have a provocation, I have put an image of mill owners building designed by Corbusier to show that when he came to India, the form begins to fragment. The form begins to break a lot, and there are many layers to his form when Corbusier comes to India. This is just two. It's not really in the mainstream, but if we step back a little, when we walk on the Indian street, we will find that we don't know who, but somebody would have created a small shrine, uh, placed a god in it, will come every evening and light a lamp. And each of these gods have a different form. But what it does to city life is that it creates a new mythology of imagining the city itself. So the city we're not planning only efficiently as main road, tertiary road, street, neighborhood, but we're also planning layers of mythologies which allow each citizen to imagine the city in the way they want. Again, to just come to a few contrasts, and of course, contrast doesn't mean one belongs to one zone and doesn't belong to another. There's always a conversation and dialogue that between regions one may get inspired, and when it crosses regions, the same element may get redefined. But by and large, we find in a climate like India, we can really, other than in summer, we can really be in the outside all the time. It's not so cold. But I know when I traveled to Europe for the first time from India, uh, it was such a surprise for me because it was so cold. And what to people in Europe was normal weather was very cold weather for me in the beginning. Then, of course, after 6 months, I got used to it. But it gave me an idea that the architecture in Europe, when you observe a little closely, I don't want to generalize, but the architecture in Europe, the, the envelope or the form has to be quite sharp uh, to protect from that cold. And therefore, the idea of the object in space, the idea of form is a much more clearer idea in Europe. Whereas in India, because we are carving out space, everything is carved out, the form becomes more accommodative, adaptive, additive, and the form doesn't try to be a primary pristine form. You know, in history, I'm talking about history, more or less. I'm generalizing. This is not a rule for all projects. On the right here is again the Church of La Tourette, and the way the light is coming in, and then you have the Indian street and a very different light coming into that street. We were influenced by Colin Rowe at that time. This was the 1980s, more than 35 years ago. We were influenced by Colin Rowe when he was discussing the idea of ancient Rome and maybe Villa Radios or Radiant City by Corbusier, where you suddenly get objects in space as the new city, whereas the old city was carved out streets. And that's the difference between how we experience public space, how we experience form, how we experience architecture with a different imagination. In Miloners, you can see Corbusier attempting or Corbusier exploring a completely new hidden random order where there are fragments, there is some kind of definition, but you will see that at each point he doesn't align the structure shifts, and there are almost 4 or 5 different layers, and each layer does not align with the other and yet gives a sense of frame, and it's really an exploration of fragments which are freely sitting, a very powerful form. I come back to the history of India. Now, one reason I'm doing this is also so that we are constantly moving away from pristine forms. We are going into a whole range of imagery that is constantly emerges in the Indian city, in the Indian mind. And then we'll see that it emerges in cave paintings, the Buddhist cave paintings. It emerges in Indian art. And on the right is actually my first year students' work, where we are exposing them now to this kind of work and making them draw freely interpretations of the sun, the moon, converting it into. So we are exploring another kind of projects in our school now to see how do we connect with this lost history, but not to imitate it, not to bring it back, but to see its energy, to see its possibilities. So if we look at Ajanta Ellora or any of these Buddhist or Hindu temples or Jain temples, we will see that there is always a path. The path is meandering all the time. It's not a clear axis, but when we move around the path and we go on moving around the path without traveling on the axis, we get the idea of the axis. So many times we can travel around an object, not travel on the axis, and still experience the axis. So that's one kind of an imagination where we need not directly experience the axis by walking on it, but experience the axis by suggestion and walking around the axis. You know? And when the British were documenting Indian work, they would always think, and they have written about it, that the Indian work is very confused. It doesn't have the clarity of form, it doesn't have the clarity of axis, it doesn't have the clarity of movement. But what is reality is these are two very, very different imaginations. One develops a clarity like in India from the intangible, and in Europe after Renaissance, after Enlightenment, you see a clarity coming from a very rational understanding of form. So I go back to the river, the way the river is inhabited in a very, very informal way. And these festivals that happen in India, below you see, these are large cities of 1 million and 2 million people. And these cities emerge in less than 1 month. And then they have a festival in this city, and then the city disappears in another month. So these are like very temporary, very large cities. It's as big as Chandigarh or even bigger than Chandigarh, that an entire city can come up in a month and then vanish in a month. So this may be one idea for an ecological city made in cloth, but this is how the religious festivals in India have happened. So for a moment, we again remove what human beings are doing and we observe again the planet that we are living on, and we try to understand the geographies. We see that there could be a river in the backwater, it has a certain kind of trees, a certain kind of spirit of living, and then we can have mountains or plains. This is how Corbusier must have seen when he came to design Chandigarh, these kind of mountains, which inspired him to build then below the mountains somewhere here. But these are inspirations for habitation. So we come back to Ahmedabad. Now, the other experience I had was between Ahmedabad and Chandigarh. When I went to study in Ahmedabad, this is in 1984, my brother went to study and he was in Chandigarh. And that time I did not know so much about architecture. So I went more to Chandigarh first to meet my brother, not to see Corbusier's work. And then I experienced Corbusier's work because I was just joining architecture. So these two cities became very important because I was going, one, there was a personal experience, but I was also going there to see the work. And you can see how Corbusier in India reinterprets a complete language, a completely new imagination to inhabit an ancient land. This is a stepwell. I'm contrasting it now with a 10th century stepwell. So this is a stepwell that I had measured drawn when I was in my final year thesis in CEPT Ahmedabad, guided by Professor Vasavda. It was a project that he was doing, a book he was writing, and he invited me to be in the team to measure. These are drawings which I did when I was in final year in Ahmedabad, and we stayed in this stepwell for almost 10 months in the well. We were coming out in the evening, going back into this well early morning. And there was a person who would send us food from the well from above and send us food down so that we don't have to climb up 7 stories every day. So we would eat our food there, and it took us almost 8 to 10 months to measure this whole stepwell. But it was an amazing experience to understand how a simple well can become a very important community center for an entire town. And so in this imagination, we don't have to think of water as a well. We can think of water as a community space. It's really like a space for celebration. It's a space for community. It's a space for festival. It's a space for the religious festival of the god and water. So it becomes sustainable also, but it also has a function. And that experience of 10 months living in this well to measure this well was at one level also giving me, I don't know why, but it gave me memories of La Tourette, which are not connected with this at all. So this is the stepwell. You will see how carefully it has been shaped, and it's underground, and it has 7 levels, and it's one of the most elaborate stepwells in India, which every corner of this stepwell our team has measured and drawn, and the models are there. I come back now because of there were 2 cities which have also fascinated me, and one is Venice, the other is Varanasi, and both have a very strong relationship between land and water. Both to a certain extent created their own land. So it was not as if the land was completely given. They also shaped and created their land to have a dialogue with the water. But these 2 cities in a way began to reveal to me how we are inhabiting the space. In Varanasi, the water does not come into the city. The water remains at the edge of the city. But the city is on a high topography and comes down with steps which are called ghats. And I used to wonder every morning, 1 million people wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and 1 million people walk to the east in Varanasi to the river, and 1 million people pray to the early morning sun, and 1 million people enter the river at one time. Now, it may be to clean them of their sin, it could be a ritual, it could be for attainment of spiritual fulfillment, whatever the reason. 1 million people are getting up in a city, walking to the east, and then immersing into the water, complete head down. And there's another city like Venice, where the canals come in like veins into the city, and yet the citizen of Venice will not get up and immerse in the water. Of course, there's climate, there are a lot of other reasons, but they will not immerse. But there is a very, very different kind of relationship, a very magical relationship of water and land in Venice. And here, the water is distant, and yet the entire citizens are immersing and getting wet and going into the water. And this has happened for maybe thousands of years, you know. So you wonder, what is it that is shaping and influencing this kind of imagination that happens in two different places across continents? So this is how they immerse, and it is very natural, very normal, and the river has most often warm water. And because the steps are there, whether the river goes high water or low water, high tide, because of the steps, the water is always connected to you because of the steps. It develops a relationship of you can easily touch the water. But if the section of the water was a sharp section, then every time the water is distant, you cannot touch the water easily. I just brought in a few sketches that I made. These are very old sketches. These are made in 1987 and 88. But I brought it in because these are my early understandings of what Venice, this view of Venice, actually, this does not exist. I drew it from various positions in Venice, and I then made a collage. And so this view of Venice you will never find. It does not exist. But yet when someone sees it, they say it's Venice. It is not Venice. It is really a Venice in the mind. But La Tourette, of course, that exists. It's a drawing I made early in the morning, and then some other collages. So we return back to India, and we look at, in this early phase of India, how did the early architects, whether it's Charles Correa or B.V. Doshi, who were inspired by Louis Kahn, who were inspired by Le Corbusier, who were inspired by the modernists, how did they kind of try to bridge the European modernism with this celebration, with the festival, with this level of color, so many colors, details that they were seeing in India. So it was a very, very different kind of modernism where the forms began to fragment, the forms began to break. There was a combination of natural materials and concrete. It was not only concrete. And there was a combination of load bearing as well as concrete columns, and a lot of wood. So one really saw, and stone, of course, because stone is easily available. So it evolved between the 1950s and the 80s. 80s is when we joined Professor Doshi's office, but that first 30 years, it was evolving an imagination of another kind of modernism. It was not the modernism that Louis Kahn or Corbusier was discussing. So this is an early project where Professor Doshi and Professor Raje were working with Louis Kahn. in Ahmedabad. And you must have heard the institute is been planning to demolish these dormitories for various reasons. And we have been requesting and conversation with the institute to save these dormitories because 20th century architecture now in India, because of land value and various other reasons, is now under threat. So that's why I brought this dormitory, a very monastery kind of a dormitory. And Louis Kahn was aware of the Buddhist monasteries, was aware of Nalanda, was aware of a lot of the Indian construction techniques. And of course, his inspiration from Carcassonne, from Rome, his inspiration from Roman architecture evolved into a new kind of imagination for India. And that's the imagination of a new institution, a new place of learning, and a very free and open place of learning. I again return to some of my other drawings which are grappling or attempting to understand this bridge. Of course, Piranesi, this time I even traveled to Piran and all those regions where Piranesi was supposed to be living, and Ljubljana, because Piranesi for some reason has been a very strong force. The city where I stay in has had a relationship with Rome for the last 2000 years. So near where I stay, they have found one of the largest collection of old Roman coins in the world. So they're surprised that a new history is opening out where I'm staying, where there's a connection with Italy and Rome, which is more than 2000 years old. And that's why there is a connection there between Rome. So these kind of drawings I do more not to, when the drawing is happening, I don't know what I'm drawing. So I draw in order to know. I don't draw what I know. And as I'm drawing, so some drawings will go in a certain way, another drawing can go in another way. And then the drawing sometimes doesn't end. I may go back to this drawing and change it again or add something. The reason I'm talking about that is because even in the projects we are doing, many of the projects we're doing in the remote rural areas, very remote rural areas of South India. We work with the community. We teach the community brickwork and how to build their homes. And the community, it's almost like a final year studio where the community discusses the kind of home they want to build. They make a lot of drawings, and then with the community we build. And so that's another way of, and these buildings are done, again, these small structures are done to look at the rural economy, but these can grow into houses. You can add a floor, you can add a staircase, and you will see even the plan is drawn on the site. We don't draw a plan in the office, we draw a plan on the site. So you will see at any time all the trees will be there, and this is a very new construction, but it will look as if it was old because all the trees are also there. So that's one kind of projects we are doing. And another kind of projects we're doing are, of course, very well designed. I mean, designed in the sense the control is within the office. In the other project we're doing in the rural areas, we're working with the community. So the community is part of the design. They're deciding the size of the rooms. The community is also deciding colors. It's a collaborative design process. Here, it's like an architect designing, and you'll see the influences coming on. So we are attempting to design these kind of eco resorts. This is for a group called the Tata Group. Again, the village also was funded by the Tata Group. This is a resort for the Tata Group, and where we use the same material that we used in the village. So the floor is the same floor we used in the village, the same plastering, and it's completely open. And though it is a 5-star hotel, it's not air conditioned, and we've kept natural ventilation in a 5-star hotel. This I designed in collaboration with architect Dean de Cruz in Goa. So you'll see these are the kind of expressions we're attempting, and later on a lot of additions will come to this hotel. It's not a complete form, and these are the kind of spaces that develop inside. This is a very hot place, so we have to bring in light very carefully. If I bring in more light, the place will become very hot, and it's not air conditioned, so we have to be very careful on how we open the building, or which side, or which, whether on the east or west. And then slowly now the greenery is growing here and the plantations are growing, and that becomes the wall of the building. These are, again, I go back to some drawing. These all happen simultaneously. So they may look as if there is no consistency, there's a lot of diversity, but one is doing it because these are simultaneous processes which are happening. This was an exposition we had at Zagreb on an invitation from Oris of a range of drawings, and then we had a small kind of workshop with the Zagreb School of Architecture. So this is the other proposed work we are talking, where we are looking at forms which build from fragments, not forms which are complete. They build from fragments. And on the right you will see students. These are students from Braunschweig University, Germany. So in our center we get students from Germany, Southeast Asia, South Africa, New Zealand, China, and they all come and work on these projects. This is a German student now making a floor tile along with the local craftsmen. So they make with the local craftsmen and then we build. So these are very, very organic experiences where the form, actually the form is more accidental, the form is fragmented, and yet happens from such a close discussion that the form or the space that is made has to meet the needs of that rural community, of that village, which is also participating in this construction. So since I was discussing so much about experiences, differences, diversity, I thought for a moment we can come back and look at how this was choreographed, one of the ideas of how it may have been choreographed. So if we look at it at one level, it's like the plan of Jaipur. At one level, it appears to have a very strong geometry, a very strong ordering principle, a very strong axis, a strong sense of center, a periphery. So all the principles seem to be appearing when it is an imagination as a drawing, when it's an imagination as a geometry. But then what happens is that when the process of construction starts, many of these temples, I'm not saying all the temples, many of these temples are built by different village communities in different areas. So slowly, maybe these columns are built by one village community, the other set of columns by another community, and each community more or less may or may not know what column or what element is emerging at the other side of the temple. All they know is sense of proportion, all they know is a certain hidden order which is given to them, and then they know the geometry, but the actual expression is then diverse. So when we visit these Buddhist or Jain or Hindu temples, or even the mosques which came in the 10th and 12th century, we find a practice of construction where each column, and there can be at times 1000 columns, 300 columns, each column is a different interpretation of a different architect craftsman. So when the entire form comes together, it comes like a story which we could not have imagined from the beginning. It comes like a story which I can visit again and again and again, and each time I will discover a new story. So while there is an ordering, the ordering looks quite simple, may look quite strong and rigid also at times. The ordering may look very access oriented, yet when the process is evolving, the process is made so diverse that when we inhabit that form, when you see the light quality, when you see the elements, when you see the kind of variations in the color of the stone or the motifs which are carved in that stone, you'll find that it's really trying to express the entire infinite biodiversity that we are seeing around us in this geography. So this is just some images. This is again very near my home. It is called the Durga Temple, very near my home. And you'll see here the goddess is fighting the forces of evil, and it's a real paradox that the goddess is shown quite small, evil, so-called evil, is shown large but very brave, very uh, pristine proportions. Evil is not shown as something bad, but is shown with a lot of dignity, and so it's a certain kind of paradox. You can see the form, you can see how it has evolved, and this is about 1400, 1500 years old, very near my home, and you'll see that this becomes part of our living experience now, because you're there, you're seeing it, and you wonder how did they carve these. And this is carved, these are not built, this is from a large rock carved out, so it's a reverse process. These temples are carved from the top to the ground and not built from the ground up, because they had to carve it out, like almost like the way maybe 1000 years later Michelangelo is carving out his prisoners from his unfinished sculpture. When I saw Michelangelo's prisoners in the Louvre, the unfinished prisoners carved, you almost feel, you can see the prisoners are trapped in that stone. Here it is releasing from the stone. And so there are two different ways of carving, but this is really an excavation of space rather than a creation of form. And behind it, why is this all happening? Because behind it is a celebration of a god who at the end of the festival is then immersed into the sea, and the idol of the god vanishes into the sea. So there is a whole cycle of creation, preservation, and then dissolution, or it dissolves and then again creates. So the architecture starts trying to express that idea of creation, preservation, and dissolution. We come back again to geometries. So here you will see this is a part of Ahmedabad again. If we remember what Colin Rowe was discussing, the city is carved out. So it looks like a large block of form in which the roads and the courtyards and the open spaces are carved out, and it's in the void that life starts happening. It is not like Radiant City, an open space in which we place the object. This is the reverse. And that is why the earlier cave of carving out, the way a city is made of carving out, is a very different reverse process. So again here there's a carving out, a very different reverse process of thinking about how we may live, and the kind of light coming in, the kind of interior that happens because of it, the kind of central courtyard which connects us back to the sky, all these are different elements of this imagination. So below are two different diagrams, one of Jaipur and one of a city called Srirangam, again geometric, but when you're actually in the city, you'll see it is very, very organic. So there is a geometry which constantly allows the freedom of the organic, and the two then relate to give one. Geometry gives us orientation, the organic gives us freedom. So how do we combine orientation and freedom through choices and variations, even though there is a hidden underlying order? And I think that has been the challenge of the imagination of Indian cities. I just brought back that image. This is done by my first year students last week. I was surprised. We were giving them, showing them a lot of images and then asking them to draw, and so they were drawing these forms. I come to, just to bring it back to a certain, I come to two experiences. One again of the Pantheon, and I recall the first time I walked into the Pantheon. I was, I think, a third year student, and at that time there was no mobile phone or no internet. So if we were leaving home in India and going to Europe, our family or our school will not know where we are because there's no connection. And for 1 year or 2 years, our family, the school doesn't know where we are because we're traveling in Europe and there's no internet, no mobile, no connection. And it's that time that when one experiences the Pantheon, I think it started to rain very heavily in the Pantheon. And that's when I realized the experience of whether a Pantheon is open or whether Pantheon is closed. And that experience of the Pantheon when it rains heavily uh, really makes us question uh, how and what we want to do with our architecture. How are the elements going to emerge, and how are they going to have a dialogue with the way we live? And at another level, 10 months and more living in the stepwell, again, which was open to sky and yet had a kind of a container. You felt within a certain space. It had different levels. Was again something where the imagination works, that it is not done only for water, but it is done with so many other layers and meanings. So I think one of the interesting part of this present phase for me on the last 1 or 2 years has been to relook at all these meanings, whether the meanings are shared with others or whether it's an individual meaning. That's the next question. But I think if each of us, or if I know for me, that to look back at these meanings, the meanings are also changing, the memories of the experiences also are changing. But then when we look at this, we realize that in the last 3,000 or 5,000 years, there is a certain imagination which has emerged from a territory or a geography. And that's what this is trying to discover. And this is again the geography, which is, there is nothing static in nature, there's nothing static in geography. Every time I return to this forest, which is very near my home, it has changed. And yet I know it is the same forest. And that is the cycle of change, whether it's time, whether it is season, day and night, when it becomes ages, then suddenly you get a monsoon. And so that is what maybe in the ancient world made us feel that there is some other energy beyond human energy which is making all this happen. Because you wonder, how did all this happen? We may give some scientific answers, but always behind a scientific answer, there will always be the next why, which we cannot answer. And that's the intangible. So these are just some random studies in my studio 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, and where we're taking elements, playing with the elements, working with topographies, building it with plaster, maybe pouring water with it, creating fragments of memories. So in the left is a fragment of one of the students' grandmother's house, which he built. And so it's really a combination of these possibilities and challenges. I will more or less end with this because this is our present work with uh, war refugees, with disaster mitigation and remote rural areas, where we are trying to work now with these very remote rural communities, which want to build on their own. So our role as architects becomes one of catalyst, becomes one of support, not like the traditional designer. And yet at the same time, when we work with these ancient communities, they're carrying so much indigenous knowledge. They know so much about the plants there, about medicinal herbs, about ancient medicine. And so there's so much more that we can learn from these communities. And at the same time, we can collaborate with them to build a habitat, which is again very organic. And this is really a project which is on, it's not completed. And we're attempting to see how it will evolve. We have no idea. It's all done in different stages, different technologies. They make the brick themselves in the community. The wood is from the region. And then we're trying to build and see how we can evolve this. So this is more or less my presentation today. It's called the Geography of Imagination, and it looks at topography, it looks at environment. In some way, it looks at sustainability because we are trying to live with what we have, and at the same time, it's trying to see how can we, even in a difficult time, try to celebrate and try to understand what is happening around us, even though we are right now in a very, very difficult time. And that's when communication, so I would say, though it is a difficult time, it is very, it's also a happy and a strange moment that the same time made us to come together on a virtual digital platform. And when these digital platforms were there for more than 20 years, I would say it did not happen so often. But now, when we are confined, or now when we have become more conscious of our boundaries, because we are not, because the mobility is being restricted, I think new boundaries in the imagination of the mind through digital space also can evolve. And in our school and in our group of architects, we have a festival next week. I'll send a link. Those who are interested can log on. There's Professor Doshi who's going to talk about his life journey, and many other architects are going to talk about their journeys next week. But the idea now is to look at how do we imagine and how can we broaden the imagination, though we are in a situation of social distancing where boundaries are becoming stronger and stronger. Are there other ways of transcending these geographies and boundaries? And that right now is the way in which our search is going. Yeah. Thank you very much. So this is the presentation. If someone has some thoughts, or we can go back to it, or I hope you're aware this was in line with your studio, or what you all are discussing.
Well, thank you very much, Nandam. It was really a wonderful presentation. Let's give the opportunity to someone who wants to talk with you, or make a question about you were doing so many things. Well, when we all know your, I mean, India and the close relation that have with Europe, no? But we are so far from you. I'm talking about South America or Latin America, that probably we are a very unknown geography.
Yes.
And when I was for the first time in India, you had invited me on Jaipur. I was talking in my presentation for one curious thing, that what was the first the first historic name of Paraguay.
Okay.
The first name of Paraguay was the giant province of India.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because this is our first name, because Europeans wanted to go to India,
Yes.
and by accident he came to America and
Yeah.
discovered America, and they thought that was India. Uh, and that's why the first name of Paraguay was the giant province of India.
Okay. One
So,
very interesting.
yes, yeah, yes. So if anyone wants to have a conversation with Professor Durganand Balsavar, the microphone is open. What are the relation with the others countries or geography from Asia, Nandam?
See, how it happened is that there was always a continuous connection between China, Asia, India, and Europe. And this connection was there for more than 2000 years. And for instance, in my city, there is a research which is on that Marco Polo had come and stayed in my city. There is also a research on how 2000 years ago the Romans were again in my city. So I think this communication was there all the time, but in the last 100 or 150 years, we lost the memory of that connection. And I think the memory was lost in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. We lost the memory of the connection between these regions. And so we started looking at a culture as if it was evolved in an isolated way. My own thinking is that all the cultures evolved through a dialogue, and all the cultures evolved through a certain communication, and that communication may be recorded at times or may not be recorded. A simple story which surprised me a few years ago: in the 15th century, the Portuguese king, the king from Portugal, wanted to give a gift to the Pope in Rome. And so he took an elephant from India and gifted it to Rome in the 15th century. So we know that this kind of trade, this kind of communication between India or Sri Lanka, and not only the British, this was the French. So where we are staying, there's also a French colony, and then on the west side of Goa is a Portuguese colony. So there's a Dutch colony. So I think this process of 300 or 400 years of colonization developed a certain relationship. And now there's a lot of research happening on how not only the European countries influenced India, but also how Indian thinkers and Indian things influenced Europe. So there was a cross dialogue, and there's a lot of research on this. I know, for instance, when Corbusier was designing Ronchamp, the chapel, Notre Dame Chapel, Ronchamp, Corbusier had come to Chandigarh, and the contractor in Chandigarh had fixed a glass without the frame. And it was a mistake actually. He fixed the glass without a frame. And when he fixed the glass in the window without a frame, the contractor was maybe thinking that Corbusier will be angry. because in the Corbusier original drawing there was a frame. And when Corbusier came and saw it on the site, he thought it was such a wonderful idea that he took it to the chapel in Ronchamp. That so there are a lot of details which were happening on Indian sites, which Corbusier took back to, I know, for instance, in La Tourette or Firminy-Vert or Ronchamp. The last Corbusier uh, pavilion in Zurich. Now, Zurich is a cold country. So why should Corbusier put a parasol for a Corbusier pavilion in the middle of Zurich? That parasol he evolved in Chandigarh. So we will see that even architects like Corbusier and Louis Kahn knew about this dialogue between civilizations, and whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's, and I think it becomes very interesting when we start looking at architecture from that point of view, rather than look at it only as a national architecture. You know, we say Indian architecture, European architecture. But if we open up that architecture as a dialogue, it becomes very interesting.
Yes, it is. So, maybe this class or this conversation, we may have to do in Venice, but it is impossible to have this meeting and or traveling. How are you? How how are you taking this in your school with this context right now? The how is the how do you teach architecture?
Yes, so what we did, Javier, yeah, that's a good. What we did till last week
Huh?
is we were all on the campus. We were not
Really?
online. Yeah, we were not online. We were all on the campus because we were thinking as much as we can do online or on the campus, we'll try it on the campus. But only for the last 1 week now, we have to go online because it is becoming a little more serious. But otherwise, still last week, because we could work on the campus with social distancing, we were able to build, we were able to make models, we were keeping our social distancing, and I think in smaller groups, we made the classroom a little, the studios a little smaller. So instead of 30, we had 10 each, and we changed the timetable a little. So we did manage till last week. Now we have gone online, so we're really trying to see how to work online. And those who are within the city, we are still trying to meet in smaller numbers. Those who have gone to other cities, we are requesting our architect friends if they can meet them in the evening or some conversation. So what happens while it is online, they can also go to an architect friend's office, maybe they can be and meet with him, see a model. So the live also happens, but now we are trying to imagine the School of Architecture as different small studios in different parts of India, and we are trying to explore it with my architect friends who can become this small fragment studio in that different city. So this is what we are trying right now.
Yes. Well, I think we are finished. We have to continue with our class. If someone wants to do, this is the last chance to do a question. So,
Hello.
okay.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. No. I didn't really have a question, but I just wanted to say thanks for the talk. It was very inspiring. I'm developing my thesis on the subject of frugal architecture, and I would like to explore that within the context of India for many of the reasons that you mentioned. So I'd quite like to get in touch with you if that's all right.
No, absolutely, because I think most of our work, especially the ones we're doing in the remote villages of India, we have no choice but to be frugal. You know, it's not even a choice. So it's not as if I can decide that I want to. There's no choice. And I found that when we are working like that with no choice, we begin to look at architecture in a very different way. In the beginning, it was not easy because you want to define something, you want to add an element, you want to, but gradually you start learning that from what is there and what is happening. It's like if I go to an ancient site sometimes and I see a ruin, and even that ruin has the possibility of inspiring me, though it's not complete. And because it's giving me a suggestion of the past, or it's giving me a suggestion of the future. So that's how now we've started working, so that we don't feel that with frugal architecture we're incomplete, or with frugal architecture we have less, or with frugal architecture we are denied. So we want to really explore frugal architecture as something which is complete.
Okay.
And frugal architecture which has so many new ideas in it, and that the ideas can emerge from time. The ideas need not happen just now. So time can bring in the other layers to a frugal architecture, and that is how we are exploring it. And I think, yes, we have a lot of, in as much as we're designing and we're working, I think there is a lot of learning also we are getting from the communities who have always lived in a very frugal way, you know. And if you see them, they live very full lives. They're very happy. They don't know that they're leading frugal lives, and I think that is the magic of frugal architecture, that they don't know that they're leading frugal lives. And so not knowing it is frugal is as much a magic, is as much a interesting part of this process, as much as thinking of architecture as something complete, trying to deal with all the responses that we need. So I think we are moving towards an incomplete architecture. You know? And how does that evolve? I'm not saying we have the answers, but we are in the process and we are enjoying the process. But I won't say we have the solutions. But I think as we work, we begin to see new dimensions. Actually, a lot of my drawings happen only to give me more ideas on this, you know, because on paper, if you're drawing or making a small installation or a model, those ideas which are not clear, and one of the ideas is to not keep it clear, also not become clear. So when it is not clear, we get more possibilities. When it is clear, we limit our possibilities. Now that can look like a paradox or a contradiction, but sometimes to leave it open, to not make something clear in the mind, but also build carefully. So we're not saying not clear means simply build without thinking. Build carefully, but when we're building carefully, enjoy the material, enjoy the construction, but it still can be a fragment and not complete. And so that is how we have now started looking at this whole process.
Yes.
But great, you're looking at that idea. I think it's so definitely, you know, I think it's a great idea looking at the thesis.
Yes. No, I'm also interested in how that concept of frugal architecture may apply in the European context. Like you said about when modernism came to India and it became more fragmented, and how in Europe you have more complete forms due to the climatic conditions. I mean, it's evident how enjoyable the architecture is in India. The very even though like the material simplicity, how you have these really incredible emotive spaces. And yeah, I'm just curious, like if that's if that's possible in other locations as well, or if that's something intrinsic to Indian culture and geography.
No, if I have to respond to it, and which is why some of the hidden aspects or not often discussed aspects, one discovered and while traveling in Europe is that we do not fully value the role or the relevance of light to human existence. As architects, we are so concerned about what we are building, what is our form, am I using concrete, am I using... I think if we start looking at what is light doing to us, and so in Europe, I became very conscious that the light was more gentle with me. The sun was more gentle. And in India, the sun was very, very hard. So the role of architecture in India was first to make the sun gentle, because we cannot take such hard sun all the time. Whereas in Europe, the gentleness of the sun, I think, if we look at Le Corbusier's work, or even I would say Mies van der Rohe's work, or I find that for them light, or Alvar Aalto's work, light becomes the real main element in their architecture, not the form, not the material, not the concrete. But if you read any book on modern architecture, you read anything, we are only reading about concrete, we are reading about brutalism, we are reading about some pristine form, we are talking about Palladius principles, and that's because we are so obsessed with form that we are not seeing that what is not form and what is light is actually making us understand life deeper than the form. And the more we start looking at light in that way, I think it may open some of the questions that you're looking for, because light is always available, light is there and it's an element, it doesn't cost, and yet we don't seem to be engaging with light like the most important element of what we are doing on earth, and I think that's where those were the experiences or memories that I had when I began traveling Europe, because one was now actually engaging with a different sun. It was not the same sun. Scientifically, we can say there's one sun and the earth is revolving around it, but in real life, in each place you go, you're seeing a very new sun. And if you see a very new sun, that new sun with the new geography has actually, you could be in a new planet, it need not have been Earth. But because I traveled by flight, I did 1 hour, I am thinking this is not Mars or this is not the moon, but really we don't know. We're just believing it. And so if we start looking at geography like that it is a completely new planet, it's a completely new sun, but it has that level of oxygen for me to breathe, it has the food, of course, then I think our imagination of architecture also changes.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for those thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful, Nandan. That was very developer. So thank you very much for your participation. It was really very nice to have you with us. And let's see if we can have another in the future. So thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you very much. Namaste, and let's be in touch. And thank you for this opportunity. If someone has questions later, they can always send it, and we can. Yeah, I hope we can communicate, but more, I hope we can invite you to India after this lockdown. And we have to have our next meeting in Jaipur and see how we can overcome this lockdown and this quarantine.
Yes, let's see. Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you
Goodbye.
very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Hello.